And we are back with more on News Talk Saga 960. So very glad you could join us on this edition of the Mark Petrona Show. Well, here it is, one more story that has some people wondering, is it real? Is it a conspiracy theory? Which one is the case? As all this talk comes about recently that Canada and really pretty much every country on the planet has somehow sold its soul to the World Health Organization, which, as many of us have come to believe, really is under the thumb of the Chinese these days. The talk is that there's a deal that has essentially been signed or that is very close to being signed, although not quite finalized, that will essentially put all control for future pandemics under the auspices of the World Health Organization. Cosmin Georgia is an independent journalist with True North, and Cosmin has been keeping a close eye on this story. And it's such a pleasure to chat with you, Cosmin. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Mark.
All right. So, obviously there are going to be people who say that this is just one more conspiracy theory, but I think that there's a lot more to it as more and more reputable people, including Neil Oliver over at GB News. We've featured Neil on Saga 960 in the past. He says this is a very real thing. Let's listen to what Neil Oliver had to say on GB News about this issue.
Anyone remember voting for the World Health Organization to take control of our lives? No, me neither. And yet here we are, teetering on the brink of joining most of the countries of the world in surrendering our national sovereignty under the terms of a proposed new pandemic treaty. Once British ink is dry on the necessary paperwork, we and most of the rest of the billions living on planet Earth will, in the event of another pandemic, take our instructions not from politicians we actually voted for and could hypothetically at least have the option of getting rid of, but from the unelected, faceless bureaucrats of the WHO. This is no conspiracy theory, by the way. No tin hats required. This is real and happening now. And a whole lot of people would rather you weren't paying attention. The WHO is a fabulously wealthy offshoot of the United Nations. It has its head office in Geneva and is presently headed by Ethiopian-born Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus. Know much about him? No, nor me. He and it are funded by 194 member states and also by donations from private entities. Things stand. Most of its money comes from the United States.
All right, so
let's voting for the World Health Organization to take control of our lives.
Canada is among the countries that have been funding this organization. And you've helped talk about issues around Canada funding the World Economic Forum, for instance. You've talked about all the money that's going into these organizations. What do you make of this? Talk about the fact that Leslyn Lewis, of course, a member of Parliament, Conservative member of Parliament, running for the leadership of the Conservative Party of Canada, she's come out and talked about this. Naturally, she's getting slammed by some of the pundits who believe that this is not really happening. What do you make of it?
Well, in this particular scenario, we're talking about a sort of treaty that would streamline world pandemic responses. So the nations that agree to this will take some direction or rely on the advice of the World Health Organization. Now, we know from the COVID-19 pandemic that this was already going on. Like, it's no surprise that governments listen to the World Health Organization. But this would crystallize that process. Now, it's like in the past, we've had international commitments translate into law, including UNDRIP, which is the legislation that's passed through the House of Commons on the rights of Indigenous people. That was a piece of legislation that is going to directly impact Canadians' lives. So international commitments do actually get turned into laws. So when all these journalists call the World Health Organization treaty a conspiracy theory, it's not necessarily true. We are committing to something, and it has obligations that could impact our lives at the end of the day.
Do you have any concern about the fact that the World Health Organization is largely seen as an arm of of the Chinese government. I mean, they seem to be directly under control of Xi Jinping. And so, I mean, if we are under control of the World Health Organization, and the World Health Organization is basically an extension of the Xi Jinping regime, then obviously China runs us. I mean, have you considered that?
Well, for sure, I have concerns about influence, the influence that the Chinese government extends over the WHO. We know that China has pressured the WHO to exclude Taiwan, for example, from joining that organization. I mean, they're the sole reason that Taiwan, a country that dealt with the pandemic in a miraculous fashion, was excluded. We also know recently, I read about this recently, that the WHO approved traditional Chinese folk medicine as a way to treat the symptoms of COVID-19. So this is an organization that dismissed alternative treatments, but now we're talking here about, ancient folk medicine being approved as a way to treat COVID-19 to appease the Chinese government, which seems to be peddling this. So I definitely have some concerns about the influence, whether that's going to translate to China having some control over the pandemic response in Canada. I mean, it's a complicated question to respond to, but there are ongoing problems with Chinese foreign influence as it is currently in our electoral system, and in information warfare and whatnot. So this could just be another angle through which the Chinese government could go after Canada.
Especially when you consider the brutal crackdown in Shanghai and other cities in China, where you see whole provinces and huge cities shut down. People are literally bolted into their own homes. We've seen some of those frightening, terrifying pictures of huge apartment blocks in which people are screaming. And it is truly a sight to behold, because here we have a government in China, the same type of regime that Justin Trudeau worships at the feet of, showing what little regard they have for humanity, for their own people. And if they treat their own people like prisoners, like our own prime minister treats millions of Canadians, then clearly, we don't want these people running our country. It's bad enough that we have Justin Trudeau, imposing basically a giant lockdown for 5 million Canadians who have either chosen not to get the vaccine, the COVID shots, or chosen not to disclose. And so the idea that the Chinese, of all people, are going to have, the whip hand over the way we handle pandemics through, by using the World Health Organization as a proxy, is terrifying, and should be terrifying for anybody, Cosmin. Shouldn't it be?
Well, I think the COVID-19 pandemic was a golden opportunity for authoritarian governments like the one in China. It is a perfect way to mask going after dissent, going after opposition among your population. And I think this is one of the primary reasons of what we're seeing in Shanghai and elsewhere in China is that the government might be sensing some sort of dissatisfaction among the Chinese people, or they have some intelligence that there is a brewing discontent with the Jinping regime. So they're using this pandemic and the lockdowns as a way to essentially get rid of anybody who would criticize them, anybody who would openly disobey government orders.
What are we going to do about it? I guess that's the real question. I mean, are we being steamrolled here into something that we really don't understand? I mean, there's been no debates about this that I know of. Maybe you've heard something, Cosmin. I don't know. Has this been discussed in the House of Commons? Has this apparent agreement been raised? I mean, apart from Leslyn Lewis, to her credit, she has talked about this sort of thing happening and raised the specter of relinquishing our sovereignty to this external body. And she's right to say we need to maintain control of our own pandemic response. Yeah, I'm not saying we don't consult with other people. We work with other countries, we work with other organizations, but at the end of the day, the decisions we make is for our people. We don't relinquish those decision-making processes to some other external body. I mean, as I understand it, the WHO will then be able to decide when a serious enough pandemic or health emergency is happening, and they'll decide what's to be done about it. And if a country says no, we don't agree, well, their decisions will supersede those of the country that objects to it. I mean, I don't know enough about this really to be talking about it to the degree that I am, but this is what I've heard. And so that's why I'm looking forward to talking to people like yourself and reading more about it to find out exactly what is in this agreement and exactly why we're being railroaded in the way that we are. I mean, the prime minister needs to answer to this. If this is going on behind closed doors, then we need to pull back the curtain and find out what's really going on. What say you?
Well, look, I think underlying this whole discussion is whether the WHO is even a credible voice to listen to when it comes to pandemic-related matters. I mean, this is the organization that said early on during COVID-19 that there was no human-to-human transmission. That tweet is still up there. So are we supposed to rely on an internationalist organization instead of looking at the facts of the nation? I think pandemics should be dealt with based on the circumstances of your there's multiple things you should take into account: your nation's demographics, the climate, just the distance. I mean, we're talking about Canada, a very vast country, and there's so many things that are very nation specific. So to rely on an international organization that might not really take those concerns into account seems ridiculous to me. And I have seen some discussion, as you said, by Leslie Lewis. I think she was on either CBC or Global News talking about this, but the host on that program dismissed this as a conspiracy theory. But it's not. I think the first step is let's stop listening to these people who will discredit everything that might pose a threat to their sort of ideology and their beliefs that we need to have a more international coordinated government. And let's stop listening to them dismiss everything as conspiracy theories. They did the same thing with the World Economic Forum when we have Klaus Schwab saying that he has people in Trudeau's cabinet under his influence, and it's like it's all out there, and all these individuals who dismiss it are doing themselves a disfavor because we're having a loss of credibility in these institutions, including the news media. So let's start looking at the facts. Let's start discussing things. They just want to change the channel. They want everybody tuned into what they're talking about, the issues that they want to put at the front of the narrative, so that we actually don't look under the cover or behind the curtain at the real systemic issues that are plaguing us and robbing future generations.
Cosmin Georgia joining us on Saga 960. And Cosmin is an independent journalist. He does terrific work with True North. Check his work out at tnc.com. Is it tnc.news? That's
news.
Yeah, tnc.news. I want to ask you about this story before we get to maybe some of the other stuff that you're working on. This is a story in Breitbart. Canadian Security Service warns against extreme anti-government rhetoric. This is the Canadian Security Service warning about some of the criticisms leveled at the Justin Trudeau regime. And I guess they're saying that this is not going to be tolerated. CSIS stated that there has been a rise in ideologically motivated violent extremism, or IMVE, over the last 2 years of the coronavirus pandemic, claiming that there also has been an increase in threats toward politicians and other public servants. Well, we certainly have seen some protests. Obviously, you saw what took place in Peterborough, Cosman, where Jagmeet Singh, leader of the New Democrat Party, was subjected to a bit of a rough ride. No physical contact from what I saw, but he was certainly shouted at. There were obscenities thrown at him. And so I guess this is the kind of thing that they're talking about. But from my vantage point, and I look forward to hearing your take, they really shouldn't be too surprised considering what has happened in this country over the past years. We've had lockdowns. We've had a giant protest, and not a peaceful protest that was crushed. We have people's accounts being frozen, assets being seized. We've had people thrown in jail without bail on suspected mischief, issues and charges. And so the reasons for the concern by a growing number of Canadians that our freedoms are being stripped away, which because they are. I mean, we have mobility rights, and we have 5 million Canadians who aren't allowed to fly. So the idea that somehow this is a big shock to the government, they need to wake up and smell the coffee. Things could get worse before they get better. I think this should be a giant wake-up call for the government. Instead, all they want to do is tell people to shut up and just take it. What do you think?
So I read the 2019 Canadian Intelligence Service report, which introduced the concept of IMVE, ideologically motivated violent extremism. Now that category encompasses multiple things. It's not necessarily limited to one sort of ideology. So it encompasses things like anarchist violence, white nationalist violence, other types of extremism. And the funny thing is that in their latest report on 2021, CSIS never once mentioned, and there was a Conservative MP that brought this up this week, never once mentioned the nearly 30 churches which were burnt down across Canada in the summer of last year. Not one mention about all the ongoing anarchist attacks throughout Canada targeting the energy industry and oil industry and pipelines. We recently know that there was a report of an RBC executive having two of his vehicles torched. And these individuals took credit on an anarchist website I've been reporting on for nearly 2 years called Montreal Counter Info. So there's a contingent of extremists in this country who are openly defying the law, conducting criminal activities. We could even call them terror acts because their intent are to terrorize people that they don't like throughout this country, not being held accountable whatsoever. I brought the issue of this website up with the Montreal police 2 years ago, and they didn't respond to me. They didn't say anything. Now they're looking into it after an RBC executive and former conservative cabinet member gets his cars torched. So it's really astounding to me to see how little disregard our intelligence service, our public safety services have for the people who are truly conducting really vehement and disgusting acts on our nation, including on critical infrastructure. There's so much talk about the Freedom Convoy blocking this, blocking that, leading to economic damage. But let's look at all these protesters and radical activists who have blocked our energy industry, blocked oil and gas from getting to the rest of the world. How much economic damage have these individuals caused? It could billions, if not trillions, over the last decade. So, it's just pure hypocrisy. And at this point, we can't even, pointing it out isn't even enough, because it's every single day you see this, the government being willfully blind to one side of this equation, whereas they try to blow up the threat that is mostly non-existent. I mean, when we see the amount of terror and sort of the damage that the radical left causes to Canada.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a real danger here. I've pointed it out on my show a number of times. I mean, when you have protests, that is a way for people to vent their frustrations. And so this person listening to your comments, Cody Brown, says these left-wing politicians are giving hardworking Canadians nothing else to lose. God forbid something violent happens to them, but they shouldn't be surprised that people are unhappy. And the problem with, of course, crushing protests is that people are going to get even more unhappy, and then they're going to do things that, are going to suggest that they are unhappy, have protests and the rest of it. And every time you see draconian ways to crush those protests, I mean, here's something that happened recently in Ottawa. And as is so often the case, young people are often at the front lines. And this is interesting to see this because when they start going nose to nose with the police, it tends to get ugly. Let's watch. Yeah. So as far as I could tell, that kid didn't do anything but express himself. He didn't lay a hand on that police officer. And so here's the problem, right? We're upping the ante. Every time the government cracks down, which, I mean, we're talking about a psychopath prime minister, so that's going to happen. But people are going to push back as they see that their freedoms are getting more and more infringed upon. How does an idiot like Justin Trudeau react? Well, as you would expect, which is even more crackdown. And that is going to invite even more opposition. This could get ugly, very ugly. Cosman, what do you think?
So just to get it on the record, I don't think that, confronting politicians in a violent or just even spewing profanities at them is an effective tactic to convince people to be on your side. It's just bad form, in my opinion. It's not appealing and it puts people off. But you're right to point out that who is accountable for this polarization. You have Trudeau, Jagmeet Singh talking about, we're in an increasingly divided society, and we're facing attacks from people who believe in disinformation, misinformation, etc. But when you look at it, who is responsible for dividing this society? We have a prime minister who created second-class citizens by introducing legal categories of vaccinated and unvaccinated through public health mandates. He has inflamed that rhetoric himself. You have Jagmeet Singh spreading disinformation in the House of Commons by claiming that the Freedom Convoy was responsible for the arson attack, the attempted arson that took place on an Ottawa residential building. Jagmeet Singh was the one who supported Prime Minister Justin Trudeau throughout his tenure. He was totally with the mandates and everything that the Liberal government did. So you never see these individuals take credit or sort of be responsible for their own actions. And we're dealing with a situation here in this country where a growing number of people do not feel represented by their elected legislators. They don't feel like they have a voice at the table. So, and instead of bringing these people to the table and saying, hey, what's wrong? How can we at least mend some of this situation? The government is lashing out. It is creating further distance between itself, this isolated core that is totally it's not a victim to the pressures that the rest of this country is facing, including housing and everything else. They're totally living in la la land because they get to live on taxpayer money. They don't have to deal with all the problems that this country faces, and so they're increasingly isolated, and they see themselves as morally righteous. They actually see their wrongdoings as virtuous, and they are driving this problem. They're creating further divides, further wedges, because they just can't admit that they are the ones responsible for creating this.
Do you think it matters that people like Joe Rogan, the world's most popular podcaster, has come out and referred to Justin Trudeau as a creepy effing dictator? I mean, I'd like to play his clip, but I mean, you get the hint. We all
Yeah.
heard it. Many of us heard what he said. I frankly agree with him. Does this sort of thing, do you think, resonate? Because my understanding, Cosmo, I don't know what you've heard, is that this prime minister, for all this hubris and arrogance, it's getting under his skin. The F Trudeau campaign, which is from one end of this country to the other, the growing disgruntlement, unhappiness, the protests, that it's starting to irritate him. We're seeing that in stories coming out that this won't be tolerated. You know, you're all a bunch of racists, all this kind of crap. Do you think it's helpful to have international figures, whether it's Rogan or this member of the European Parliament coming out and calling him a dictator? Do you think that this sort of thing is helpful to Canadians? The fact that there's world reaction to the actions of this slimeball prime minister?
100%. I have said this for years. I said Trudeau and the Liberal government will not back down on anything until they get shamed internationally. This is a prime minister who adores international credit. He was the one who lobbied to be on the UN Security Council. He likes to travel around Europe and make himself, the leader of global democracies. He needs to be shamed in every corner of the world, from sea to sea, and it needs to keep coming, and it needs to be on multiple different issues, including his crackdown on internet, trying to regulate the internet. He needs to be shamed for not responding to the arson attacks on churches. He needs to be shamed for continuing a mandate that discriminates against millions of Canadians by not letting them travel inside or outside of the country. This is somebody who likes to be seen as an affluent individual. I mean, Jordan Peterson put it best, right? This is a narcissist we're dealing with. So he is lashing out. And I think the vaccination policy on travel is the prime example, right? This is somebody who is very, very vindictive, and he's trying to take out his anger by punishing people who he sees as not going on along with his agenda.
Yeah, and it makes you wonder how bad things are going to get before something comes to a head, because, unstoppable force meets immovable object. I mean, things could get a lot worse, because he doesn't strike me as the guy who's going to back off, because to me, he seems like a guy who's all in. You know what I mean? There is no backing off, because this is everything for him. This is his reason for being, bringing about this great reset through a collapse, essentially what he thinks will be an organized collapse of our economy, which I think that's what he's pushing for. Everything that he does is aimed at wrecking our economy, undermining our country, labeling it as racist and all this crap. He heaps abuse. Every day this guy gets out of bed is one more day that he looks at how to wreck this country. And so to me, he's not going to back off. I don't know. I see where this is headed, man, and I don't like it. This is, what do you think?
I think Trudeau is committed to his ideology, right? This is somebody who buys into the World Economic Forum's idea of stakeholder capitalism. He's all for it. Whether he's intentional, whether he gets out of bed and says, well, I'm going to try to ruin Canada's economy, I'm not so sure about that, but I think he's committed to an ideology which its secondary effects are leading to the ruin of multiple industries across Canada, and it's robbing people of their futures. So yeah, I think that's my general take. His ideology is totally disconnected from reality.
You can't build
reality.
back better. You can't build back better without wrecking it first, because that's the only way you can justify radical reform is by reducing what you have to rubble. And so that's
Right.
what we're seeing.
There's the old, saying, why tear down a fence if it already works, right? So I think this is what we've seen, instead of, especially with the energy sector, instead of trying to improve the efficiency and instead of trying to make oil and gas more clean. And I think Canada, its standards are fantastic as it is. We have probably the cleanest energy industry in the world. He's trying to limit that, through the No Pipelines Act, through failing to get the pipeline in the U.S. Through, after Biden axed it at the beginning of his tenure. So this is Trudeau, right? Like, reality is going to slap him in the face, but the consequences are that we're going to have to deal with the effects
aftermath.
Yeah.
I don't know. This is the most powerful stress test that we've ever had our country, in my view. If we survive this as a reasonably free and open country, it will have been an accomplishment that I think we could look back with a great deal of pride. But first, we've got to survive. Cosmin, thank you so much for coming on the show today. I really appreciate this.
No problem. Thanks for having me.
How do people consume your terrific content?
So yeah, you can visit us at tnc.news, or you can find me on Twitter at CosminDZS.
All right, Cosmin, Georgia. Thank you. And we got to take a brief commercial break. Back with more on Newstalk Saga 960 and the Mark Petronis Show after this.